Detective Lisa Chen had always loved the quiet streets of Oakwood Heights. After 15 years on the force, she'd finally made it to the top, police chief of the whole town. It felt surreal walking into the station each morning, knowing she was in charge of keeping this peaceful community safe. Her house on Birch Lane had been her sanctuary for 8 years now. A simple 2-story home with a neat front yard and a small garden that she actually enjoyed tending on weekends. The neighbors were friendly but respectful of privacy. Mrs. Patterson next door would wave from her kitchen window, and old Mr. Rodriguez across the street always had a kind word when they bumped into each other at the mailbox. Life was good, or at least it had been until 3 weeks ago. That's when Patricia Williams moved into the house directly across from Lisa's. Pat, as she quickly introduced herself to everyone within a 5-block radius, was a woman with what you might charitably call strong opinions about how things should be done. She'd retired early from her job managing a small insurance office and had apparently decided that her new full-time career would be managing everyone else's business. Lisa first noticed something was different on a Tuesday morning when she was rushing out to work. There was Pat, standing in her front yard at 7 in the morning wearing a bathrobe and holding a clipboard. She was staring intently at the garbage cans lined up along the street, writing something down with the intensity of someone conducting a scientific study. "Morning," Lisa called out politely as she walked to her car. Pat looked up, squinting at Lisa like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Are you the one in the blue house?" "That's me," Lisa replied, pointing to her front door. Pat said, making another note on her clipboard. "We'll see about that." Lisa had no idea what that meant, but she was already running late for a staff meeting. She shrugged it off and drove away, thinking Pat was probably just one of those quirky neighbors every street seemed to have. By the end of that first week, it became clear that Pat wasn't just quirky. She was on a mission. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it first when Lisa bumped into her while getting the mail. "That new woman across the street came by yesterday," she said, glancing nervously toward Pat's house. "She had this whole folder of papers and started asking me about neighborhood rules. I told her we don't really have any formal rules, just common courtesy. But she insisted there must be written guidelines somewhere." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "What kind of guidelines?" "Oh, everything. When we can put our trash out, what color our mailboxes should be, how tall our grass can grow. She even asked if there were restrictions on what kind of cars we can park in our driveways." Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "I've lived here for 22 years, dear. We've never needed rules like that." That weekend, Lisa learned just how serious Pat was about her new role as neighborhood watchdog. She was in her backyard, enjoying a rare Saturday morning off with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, when she heard voices from the front of her house. Curious, she walked around to see what was going on. Pat was standing on the sidewalk with Mr. Rodriguez, gesturing dramatically at Lisa's front yard while consulting what appeared to be a thick binder. "The grass is clearly over the acceptable height," Pat was saying, pointing at Lisa's perfectly normal lawn. "And look at that mailbox. It's not regulation size." Mr. Rodriguez, bless him, looked completely bewildered. "Pat, I think you might be confused. We don't have those kinds of rules in this neighborhood." "Well, we should," Pat declared firmly. "A community needs standards, structure. Someone has to maintain property values." Lisa walked over, still holding her coffee mug. "Morning, folks. Everything okay?" Pat turned to her with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Actually, no. As the new neighborhood standards coordinator, I've identified several issues with your property maintenance." Lisa blinked. "I'm sorry, the what coordinator?" "Standards coordinator," Pat repeated as if it were obvious. "Someone needs to ensure this neighborhood maintains its quality and character. I've taken on that responsibility." "Pat," Mr. Rodriguez said gently, "who exactly appointed you to this position?" Pat's chest puffed up with pride. "I appointed myself. When I moved here, I immediately saw the need for proper oversight." "Do you know some people on this street don't even edge their sidewalks regularly?" Lisa took a sip of her coffee, studying Pat with the same attention she'd give to a suspect during an interrogation. This woman was clearly serious about whatever authority she'd decided she had. "And what exactly are these issues with my property?" Pat flipped open her binder with the flourish of someone presenting evidence in court. "Your grass is approximately half an inch over the recommended height. Your mailbox post needs repainting. And you have unauthorized decorative elements. Unauthorized decorative elements. Lisa looked around her front yard, confused. Pat pointed triumphantly at the small garden gnome Lisa had bought at a garage sale last summer. It was sitting cheerfully among her flowers, about 8 inches tall and completely inoffensive. Lawn ornaments require community approval. Mr. Rodriguez caught Lisa's eye and gave her a look that clearly said, "I'm sorry you have to deal with this crazy person too." "Pat," Lisa said carefully, "I appreciate your enthusiasm for the neighborhood, but we don't actually have any formal homeowner association rules here. People are free to maintain their properties as they see fit, as long as they follow city ordinances." Pat's eyes narrowed. That kind of attitude is exactly why this neighborhood needs proper management. Without standards, property values decline. Without enforcement, chaos follows. She snapped her binder shut and marched back toward her house, calling over her shoulder, "You'll be hearing from me about this." Lisa and Mr. Rodriguez watched her go in stunned silence. "Well," Mr. Rodriguez finally said, "that was interesting." Over the next 2 weeks, Lisa learned that Pat's visit to her yard hadn't been an isolated incident. She was methodically working her way through the entire neighborhood, armed with her binder and an apparently inexhaustible supply of complaints. The Hendersons at the end of the street got a lecture about their dog walking schedule. The young couple with the new baby was informed that their stroller constituted unauthorized street equipment when they left it on their front porch. Even sweet old Mrs. Chen, who'd lived quietly in the corner house for 30 years, was told her bird feeders were attracting undesirable wildlife. But Pat seemed especially focused on Lisa's house. Every few days, Lisa would spot her across the street, standing in her yard with that clipboard staring at Lisa's property and writing notes. Sometimes she'd even walk slowly past the house, pausing to examine the mailbox or peer at the garden. Lisa found it more amusing than annoying at first. After dealing with actual criminals all day, a self-appointed neighborhood busybody seemed pretty harmless. Pat was clearly someone who needed a hobby, and if playing HOA president made her happy, what was the real harm? That attitude changed the day Lisa came home from work to find Pat in her driveway. Lisa pulled up to see Pat standing next to her garbage cans, holding a measuring tape and writing in a small notebook. She was so absorbed in whatever she was doing that she didn't even notice Lisa's car until the door slammed shut. Pat looked up with the expression of someone caught in the act, but then quickly composed herself and straightened her shoulders. "There you are," Pat said, as if Lisa arriving at her own house was somehow unexpected. "We need to discuss your trash container placement. City ordinance clearly states they must be positioned no more than 3 feet from the curb, and yours are at least 4 feet out." Lisa walked slowly toward her front door, Pat following along like an unwanted shadow. "Pat, first of all, you're wrong about the ordinance. Second, why are you measuring my garbage cans?" "Someone has to maintain standards," Pat replied, undeterred. "If everyone just does whatever they want, the whole neighborhood falls apart." Lisa stopped at her front door and turned to face Pat directly. "I need you to understand something. This is my private property. You can't just come into my driveway and start measuring things." Pat blinked, looking genuinely surprised. "I'm performing a community service." "No," Lisa said firmly. "You're trespassing. Please don't come onto my property again without permission." Pat's face flushed red. "I'll have you know I have every right to ensure community compliance. You can't just ignore the rules because you think you're special." Lisa unlocked her front door, already exhausted from this conversation. "Pat, for the last time, there are no community rules. There's no HOA. There's no standards committee. There's just you with a clipboard bothering your neighbors." As Lisa stepped inside and closed the door, she heard Pat muttering something about people who think they're above accountability. Little did Lisa know, that was just the beginning. The first official-looking document appeared on Lisa's front door 3 days later. She almost missed it entirely, tucked as it was between the door and the frame like a court summons. Lisa pulled it free and unfolded what appeared to be a professionally printed notice, complete with letterhead that read Birch Lane Community Standards Committee, in bold formal lettering. Below that, in smaller text, it listed Patricia Williams as Enforcement Coordinator and Neighborhood Liaison. The document itself was remarkable in its attention to detail. It included Lisa's full address, the date, and even a case number. The violation description read like something from an actual city office. Property located at 1247 Birch Lane has been found in violation of community standard 3.2.1 regarding acceptable grass height maintenance. Current grass height measures 3.2 inches, exceeding the maximum allowable height of 2.5 inches. At the bottom in red ink was the fine amount, $250. Lisa stared at the paper, reading it twice to make sure she wasn't imagining things. The audacity was breathtaking. Pat had actually created fake violation notices and was trying to fine her neighbors. She walked inside, tossed the notice on her kitchen counter, and forgot about it. Real police work demanded her attention, and she had actual crimes to worry about. A convenience store robbery downtown, a string of car break-ins near the mall, and budget meetings that seemed to drag on forever. But Pat wasn't done. Oh no, Pat was just getting started. The second notice appeared 4 days later. This time it was for unauthorized lawn ornamentation display, referring to her garden gnome. The fine, $175. The notice included a grainy photograph of the gnome, apparently taken from Pat's front yard with a zoom lens. Lisa had to admire Pat's commitment, if nothing else. The woman was creating an entire bureaucracy out of thin air. The third notice came with a twist. Along with another violation for improper mailbox maintenance worth another $150, there was an additional document titled Community Standards Handbook. It was 12 pages long, printed on both sides, and covered everything from acceptable paint colors to mandatory holiday decoration removal schedules. Reading through it was like entering an alternate universe where someone had way too much time and an obsession with controlling other people's lives. There were regulations about wind chimes being no louder than ambient conversation level. Rules about when lawnmowers could be operated, down to specific time windows. Even guidelines for how long visitors could park on the street before their cars became neighborhood disruptions. The handbook listed penalties for violations ranging from $25 for minor infractions, like leaving garbage cans out too long, all the way up to $500 for major community disruptions, like having parties without prior notification to the Standards Committee. Lisa flipped to the back page and found Pat's contact information, along with a note that all fines should be paid within 10 business days to avoid additional late fees and possible legal action. She set the handbook down and rubbed her temples. This was getting ridiculous. Over the next week, Lisa watched from her kitchen window as Pat made her rounds through the neighborhood. She'd seen Pat knocking on doors, always carrying her binder and sometimes accompanied by a measuring tape or camera. The poor Henderson family got a 15-minute lecture about their children's bicycles being stored improperly in their own front yard. Mrs. Chen stopped by one evening while Lisa was watering her flowers. "That woman across the street has been asking questions about you," she said quietly, glancing toward Pat's house. "What kind of questions?" "Strange ones. She wanted to know what kind of work you do, what hours you keep, whether you have parties or lots of visitors. I told her it wasn't any of her business, but she kept insisting she needed the information for her neighborhood files." Lisa frowned. Her neighborhood files? That's what she called them. She said she was building profiles on all the residents to better understand community needs and identify potential problem areas. Mrs. Chen shook her head. "I've never met anyone like her. She acts like she works for the government or something." The fourth violation notice was waiting for Lisa when she got home from a particularly long day dealing with budget cuts and personnel issues. This one was different. Instead of a single sheet, it was a thick envelope containing multiple documents. The main violation was for excessive vehicular noise during restricted hours, apparently referring to Lisa's car door slamming when she left for work in the morning. But attached to that was a property assessment report that made Lisa's blood pressure spike. Pat had somehow obtained or created a detailed analysis of Lisa's house, complete with photographs taken from multiple angles. There were close-ups of her front door, her mailbox, her driveway, and even her backyard taken from what must have been the second floor of Pat's house. The report noted irregularities, like the fact that Lisa's trash cans were a different brand than most of her neighbors. It questioned why her newspaper was sometimes left on the driveway for several hours before being retrieved. It even included a chart tracking Lisa's daily schedule, noting what times she typically left for work and returned home. At the bottom of the report was a summary that made Lisa's jaw drop. Subject appears to maintain irregular schedule inconsistent with traditional employment. Vehicle usage patterns suggest possible commercial activity. Property maintenance, while adequate, shows signs of inattention to community standards. Recommend increased monitoring and enforcement action. Lisa sat at her kitchen table, staring at the documents spread in front of her. Pat wasn't just playing HOA president anymore. She was conducting surveillance. The fifth notice arrived just 2 days later, and this one crossed a line that made Lisa's police training kick into high gear. It was titled, Final Notice of Accumulated Violations, and included a detailed breakdown of all the previous fines, plus several new ones Lisa hadn't even known about. Apparently, she'd been cited for inappropriate gardening, activities during community quiet hours because Pat had observed her, watering her plants after 7 p.m. There was a fine for unauthorized photography because Lisa had taken a picture of her flowers to send to her sister. Even a penalty for excessive mail delivery observation, which seemed to mean she'd been seen checking her mailbox too often. The total amount due, $875. But the real kicker was at the bottom of the notice. In bold red letters it stated, failure to remit payment within 48 hours will result in escalation to appropriate legal authorities and possible placement of liens against the property. Lisa leaned back in her chair and laughed out loud. She couldn't help it. The whole situation was so absurd, so completely detached from reality, that laughter was the only reasonable response. Pat had created an entire fictional authority structure, appointed herself to multiple positions within it, and was now threatening legal action to collect money for violations of rules that existed only in her imagination. But then Lisa stopped laughing. Because while Pat's fake HOA was ridiculous, her behavior was escalating in ways that weren't funny at all. The surveillance, the trespassing, the attempts to collect money under false pretenses. These were actual crimes. Lisa walked to her front window and looked across the street at Pat's house. The lights were on, and she could see Pat's silhouette moving around inside, probably working on her next batch of violation notices. What Pat didn't know was that she'd picked the wrong target for her little power trip. She'd unknowingly launched a harassment campaign against the one person in the neighborhood who had both the authority and the knowledge to shut her down, permanently. But Lisa was curious to see just how far Pat would go. As a police officer, she'd learned that the best way to build a solid case was to let the suspect dig their own hole as deep as possible. The next morning, Lisa made a decision. Instead of throwing away Pat's ridiculous notices, she started a file. Every document Pat sent, every photograph she took, every fake fine she issued, Lisa would keep it all. She had a feeling she was going to need evidence of Pat's escalating behavior, because if there was one thing Lisa had learned in 15 years of police work, it was that people like Pat never stopped on their own. They always pushed further, demanded more, and eventually crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Lisa just had to wait and see what Pat would do next. She had a feeling she wouldn't have to wait long. Sure enough, 2 days later, Lisa came home to find something that made her realize Pat's little game was about to become a much more serious problem. There was a new notice on her door, but this time it wasn't just addressed to her. This time, Pat had made copies and distributed them throughout the neighborhood. The heading read, Community Safety Alert, Problematic Resident Identified. Lisa's hands clenched into fists as she read the rest of it. Pat had officially declared war, and she had no idea who she was fighting. The Community Safety Alert was Pat's masterpiece of fictional authority. Lisa read it 3 times, her disbelief growing with each pass. Dear Birch Lane residents, it began. The Community Standards Committee has identified a resident whose activities and behavior patterns raise concerns for neighborhood safety and property values. The individual residing at 1247 Birch Lane has demonstrated consistent disregard for community guidelines and has exhibited suspicious behavioral patterns that warrant increased community awareness. The document went on to list Lisa's supposed infractions: failure to comply with lawn maintenance standards, irregular schedule suggesting possible illicit activities, refusal to participate in community oversight programs, and hostile behavior toward neighborhood officials. But the part that really made Lisa's blood boil was the end. For the safety and security of all residents, We encourage neighbors to report any unusual activities observed at this address to the Community Standards Committee. Together, we can maintain the quality and safety of our neighborhood. Pat had basically issued a neighborhood-wide alert suggesting Lisa was some kind of criminal who needed to be watched and reported on. She was encouraging the neighbors to spy on each other. Lisa folded the alert and put it in her growing Pat file, then walked outside to see if she could gauge how the neighbors were reacting to this latest escalation. Mrs. Chen was in her front yard looking troubled. She waved Lisa over immediately. "Did you see this ridiculous thing?" Mrs. Chen asked, holding up her own copy of the alert. "That woman has completely lost her mind. You're not taking it seriously, are you?" Lisa asked. "Of course not. I've known you for 8 years. You're the quietest, most respectful neighbor on the street." Mrs. Chen shook her head. "But I'm worried about her mental state. She came to my door yesterday asking if I'd seen any unusual traffic at your house. When I asked what she meant, she said she was investigating possible drug activity." Lisa's jaw tightened. "She said what?" I told her she was being ridiculous, but she was completely serious. "She had this whole conspiracy theory about why you keep irregular hours and drive different cars sometimes." Mrs. Chen paused. "She doesn't know what you do for work, does she?" "No, she doesn't," Lisa replied. "And I'm starting to think that might be a problem." That evening, Lisa got her first taste of how effective Pat's campaign was becoming. She was coming home from work around 8 p.m. when she noticed Mr. Rodriguez standing in his front yard, watching her pull into her driveway with an expression she'd never seen before. Not quite suspicious, but definitely more attentive than usual. When she waved, he waved back, but there was something different about his demeanor. More reserved, more watchful. Lisa realized that Pat's systematic campaign was starting to work. She was planting seeds of doubt in the neighbors' minds, making them question someone they'd known and trusted for years. The next few days brought a series of escalations that showed Pat was becoming bolder and more intrusive. Lisa came home on Wednesday to find fresh footprints in the soft dirt around her backyard fence. Someone had been walking around her property, and given Pat's pattern of behavior, it wasn't hard to guess who. Thursday brought evidence that Pat was expanding her surveillance operation. Lisa noticed Pat had started parking her car at different spots on the street, always with a clear view of Lisa's house. Sometimes she'd sit there for an hour or more, occasionally getting out to take photographs or write notes. But Friday was when Pat finally crossed the line from annoying neighbor to actual criminal. Lisa had taken a rare personal day to catch up on household tasks and was in her backyard around noon, trimming some overgrown bushes. She heard voices from her front yard and went to investigate. Pat was standing on Lisa's front porch, cupping her hands around her eyes as she tried to peer through the living room window. She had a camera hanging around her neck and was taking pictures of Lisa's front door, including close-ups of the lock and door frame. "Excuse me?" Lisa called out, walking around from the backyard. "What are you doing?" Pat spun around, looking startled for just a moment before composing herself. "I'm conducting a property safety inspection. Several neighbors have expressed concerns about security issues." "Security issues?" Lisa walked closer, noting that Pat had trampled her flower bed while trying to get better angles for her photographs. "What kind of security issues?" "Unusual activity, people coming and going at strange hours, possible code violations that could affect the whole neighborhood." Pat held up her camera. "I'm documenting everything for the official report." Lisa felt her professional training kick in. She was dealing with someone who was either completely delusional about her authority or was knowingly committing crimes and hoping to intimidate her victim into compliance. "Pat," Lisa said slowly, "you need to get off my property right now." "I have every right to conduct community safety inspections," Pat replied, not moving. "The Community Standards Committee has full authority to—" "There is no Community Standards Committee," Lisa interrupted. "There is no HOA, there are no community rules. There is just you, trespassing on my property, taking pictures of my house without permission and harassing me and my neighbors." Pat's face flushed red. "You can't talk to me that way. I'm an official neighborhood representative." "You're a neighbor with a clipboard and an overactive imagination," Lisa said firmly. "And right now you're standing on my property without permission, which makes you a trespasser. I'm asking you politely one more time to leave." Pat straightened up to her full height, which still left her several inches shorter than Lisa. "You don't scare me. I know what kind of person you are. The kind who thinks rules don't apply to them. Well, I have news for you. Everyone has to follow the rules, even people who think they're special. Lisa studied Pat's face, seeing something she recognized from her years in police work. This wasn't just someone with too much time on her hands. This was someone who genuinely believed she had authority she didn't possess, and who was escalating her behavior because her victim wasn't submitting to that imaginary authority. Pat, I want you to listen to me very carefully, Lisa said, keeping her voice calm and professional. You are trespassing on my property. You are harassing me and my neighbors. You are attempting to collect money for fictional violations of rules that don't exist. These are all crimes, and if you continue this behavior, you will face legal consequences. Pat laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Legal consequences? From who, you? What are you going to do, call the police? Lisa almost smiled. That's exactly what I'm going to do if you don't leave my property immediately. Go ahead, Pat said defiantly. I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about your suspicious activities and your refusal to comply with community standards. She turned and walked off Lisa's property, but not toward her own house. Instead, she headed down the street, probably to continue her official duties at another neighbor's house. Lisa watched her go, then went inside and made a phone call to Officer Tommy Park, one of her most trusted patrol officers. Tommy, I need you to do me a favor and run a background check on a Patricia Williams, recently moved to 1245 Birch Lane. Also, look up any HOA registrations or community organization filings for this neighborhood. Sure thing, Chief. Any particular reason? Let's just say I want to make sure I have all the facts before I handle a situation. 20 minutes later, Tommy called back with information that didn't surprise Lisa at all. Chief, there are no HOA filings for Birch Lane or any of the surrounding streets. Never have been. As for Patricia Williams, she's got a couple of interesting items in her background. 3 noise complaints at her previous address, all filed by neighbors. 2 restraining orders filed against her by former neighbors, both dismissed when she moved away. And get this, she was fired from her last job for creating fake employee handbooks and trying to implement policies she had no authority to create. Lisa nodded grimly. Pat wasn't just a busybody neighbor. She was someone with a pattern of boundary violations and authority issues. Thanks, Tommy. One more thing. If anyone calls in complaints about suspicious activity at 1247 Birch Lane, make sure they get routed to me directly. Will do, Chief. Everything okay? It will be, Lisa said. I just need to let this situation develop a little bit more before I handle it. That weekend, Pat's behavior reached new heights of audacity. Lisa woke up Saturday morning to find Pat in her driveway, measuring the distance between her car and the property line. When Lisa opened her front door, Pat didn't even look up from her measuring tape. Morning, Lisa called out. Your vehicle is parked 2.3 inches closer to the street than community guidelines allow, Pat announced, writing in her notebook. That's a $50 violation. Lisa walked down to where Pat was crouched next to her car. Pat, we've been through this. You have no authority to issue violations or fines. We'll see about that, Pat replied, standing up and brushing dirt off her knees. I've been in contact with the proper authorities about your attitude and your refusal to comply with reasonable community requests. What authorities? Pat smiled smugly. Let's just say that people who think they can ignore the rules might be in for a surprise. She walked away, leaving Lisa standing in her driveway, wondering what Pat meant by that cryptic comment. Lisa found out on Monday morning when she arrived at work to find a message from the city's code enforcement office. According to the voicemail, they'd received several complaints about a property on Birch Lane and wanted to schedule an inspection. Lisa called them back immediately. This is Police Chief Chen. I understand you received complaints about 1247 Birch Lane? That's right, Chief. Anonymous complaints about multiple code violations. Overgrown vegetation, improper trash storage, possible illegal activities. We're required to investigate all complaints, even anonymous ones. Lisa almost laughed. Pat had actually called the city to report her for the same fictional violations she'd been making up all along. I'll tell you what, Lisa said. That's my address. Feel free to come by any time for an inspection. I think you'll find the property is in perfect compliance with all actual city codes. That afternoon, Lisa made a decision. Pat's escalating behavior was affecting not just her, but the whole neighborhood. It was time to end this little game, but she was going to do it the right way. The professional way. the way that would ensure Pat never bothered her neighbors again. Lisa spent her lunch break on Tuesday doing something she probably should have done weeks earlier. Building a proper case file on Patricia Williams. She pulled up Pat's background check results and cross-referenced them with similar cases she'd handled over the years. The pattern was textbook. Pat wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was someone who systematically created conflict wherever she lived, usually by attempting to establish authority she didn't possess. The restraining orders from her previous address told a familiar story. Harassment disguised as community service, surveillance justified as safety concerns, escalating demands backed by fictional authority. Lisa printed out copies of every fake violation notice Pat had sent her, organized them chronologically, and documented the escalating nature of the harassment. She also reached out to Officer Martinez in the neighboring town where Pat used to live. "Oh man, Patricia Williams," Martinez said when Lisa explained why she was calling. "Yeah, we know her well. She made life miserable for an entire apartment complex before she moved. Started something she called the Resident Safety Initiative and tried to fine people for everything from cooking smells to having visitors after 9 p.m. Did anyone ever file charges?" "A few people tried, but she always moved away before it got serious. Smart enough to stay just barely on the legal side of things until she wasn't." Martinez paused.
"Why, what's she doing now?"
Lisa filled him in on Pat's fictional HOA scheme. "Sounds about right," Martinez said. "She escalated the same way here. Started with fake authority, moved to surveillance, then tried to get real authorities involved to back up her fake complaints. The difference is, in your case, she doesn't know she's messing with a cop." That was exactly what Lisa had been thinking. Pat's entire scheme depended on her victim being intimidated by official-sounding documents and threats of legal action. She was counting on Lisa being too confused or scared to challenge her authority effectively, but had no idea she was trying to scam someone who knew exactly what real authority looked like and had the power to back it. Up Wednesday afternoon brought the next escalation Lisa had been expecting. She came home to find a new document taped to her front door, not tucked discreetly like the others, but prominently displayed for anyone walking by to see. This one was titled, "Final Notice Legal Action Pending," and was designed to look like something from a law firm. It included fake case numbers, references to municipal codes that didn't exist, and threats of property liens and legal fees. But the most interesting part was at the bottom. A demand that Lisa appear at a community standards hearing on Friday evening at 7 p.m. at Pat's address to address violations and determine appropriate remediation. Lisa read the notice twice, impressed despite herself at Pat's commitment to her fictional bureaucracy. She'd created an entire legal proceeding out of thin air, complete with official language and procedural requirements. That evening, Lisa did something she'd been avoiding since this whole thing started. She called her Sergeant David Murphy, who lived 2 neighborhoods over. "Dave, I need to give you a heads up about something that might become a departmental issue." She explained the situation with Pat, Dave occasionally chuckling or making amaze sounds as the story got more ridiculous. "So let me get this straight," Dave said when she finished. "This woman has been running a fake HOA scam on the police chief for over a month, and you haven't arrested her yet?" I wanted to see how far she'd go. And honestly, at first it was more annoying than criminal. And now, Lisa looked out her window at Pat's house where the lights were on and she could see Pat moving around inside, probably preparing for her fake hearing. Now she's conducting surveillance trespassing, filing false reports with city offices and attempting to defraud residents with fake fines. She's also encouraging neighbors to spy on each other, which is creating actual problems in the community. "So what's your plan?" "I'm going to attend her little hearing on Friday night." Dave laughed. "Oh, this is going to be good. You want backup?" "No, I think I can handle one delusional neighbor. But I wanted you to know in case this ends up requiring arrest reports." Thursday brought confirmation that Pat's campaign was having exactly the effect she wanted. Lisa encountered the young couple from down the street while getting her mail, and their interaction was noticeably different from before. "Hi, Lisa," the woman said, but her husband pulled her along quickly, muttering something about being late for dinner. Later that evening, Mrs. Chen stopped by with information that made Lisa realize the situation was worse than she'd thought. "That horrible woman came by again today," Mrs. Chen said, settling into Lisa's kitchen chair with a cup of tea. "She's telling people you're under investigation by some kind of community safety task force." "She's what?" She has this whole story about how you've been identified as a problem resident and that there's an official process underway to address your violations. Mrs. Chen shook her head. She made it sound very official with legal procedures and everything. Lisa rubbed her temples. Are people believing her? Some are starting to. The Hendersons asked me if I'd noticed. Anything suspicious about your house, Mr. Rodriguez? Mentioned that Pat had documentation proving you were violating multiple housing codes. Mrs. Chen reached over and patted Lisa's hand. I told them it was all nonsense, but she's very convincing when she wants to be. This was exactly what Lisa had been worried about. Pat wasn't just harassing her anymore. She was systematically poisoning her relationships with neighbors who had known and trusted her for years. There's something else, Mrs. Chen continued. She's been asking very specific questions about your work schedule, what kind of car you drive, whether you have visitors. She told Mrs. Henderson she was building a case file for the authorities. That night, Lisa made a decision that went against every instinct she had as a police officer. Instead of ending this situation immediately, she was going to let Pat dig her hole even deeper. She was going to attend the fake hearing. Friday evening came with unseasonably warm weather and a neighborhood that felt different than it had just a month ago. Lisa noticed more people peeking through their windows as she walked. Across the street toward Pat's house at exactly 7 p.m., Pat answered the door wearing what appeared to be her version of business attire. A navy blazer over khaki pants and a clipboard, tucked under her arm like a briefcase. Ms. Chen, Pat said formally, thank you for attending this hearing. Please come in. Lisa followed Pat into a living room that had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Pat had arranged chairs facing a card table that was covered with file folders, official-looking documents, and a small American flag. Behind the table was a larger chair that was obviously meant to serve as Pat's judicial bench. Please have a seat, Pat said, gesturing to one of the facing chairs. This hearing will address multiple violations of community standards and determine appropriate remediation and penalties. Lisa sat down, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. Pat had really gone all out, even creating what appeared to be a court stenographer's setup with a laptop and a small recording device. Pat took her place behind the card table and opened the largest file folder. This hearing is called to order. I am Patricia Williams, duly appointed Community Standards Coordinator for Birch Lane Residential Area. We are here to address violations committed by the resident of 1247 Birch Lane. She proceeded to read from a prepared statement that covered Lisa's various crimes against community standards, complete with dates, times, and photographic evidence. She had pictures of Lisa's grass at various heights, multiple angles of her mailbox, and even surveillance photos of Lisa leaving for work in the morning. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of willful non-compliance with established community guidelines. Pat continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone who really believed she was conducting an official proceeding. The defendant has shown contempt for proper authority and has refused multiple opportunities to voluntarily comply with reasonable standards. Lisa listened to this performance with growing amazement. Pat had created an entire legal framework out of nothing, complete with procedures, evidence, and what she clearly believed was binding authority. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Pat asked, looking up from her notes. Lisa leaned back in her chair and smiled. Actually, Pat, I do have a few things to say. Pat picked up a pen ready to record Lisa's response. Please state your name for the record. My name is Lisa Chen, Lisa said clearly. I'm the chief of police for the city of Oakwood Heights. Pat's pen stopped moving. The color drained from her face as the implications of what Lisa had just said began to sink in. I've been watching your little operation for over a month now, Lisa continued conversationally. And I have to say I'm impressed by your attention to detail. You've managed to commit several felonies while creating the most elaborate fake authority scheme I've ever encountered. Pat's mouth opened and closed several times without making any sound. Let's see, Lisa said, pulling out her own folder. We've got harassment, trespassing, attempted fraud, filing false reports with city offices, and impersonating an official organization. That's just off the top of my head. Pat finally found her voice. You can't. I mean, this is a legitimate community standards proceeding. No, Pat, Lisa said gently. This is you sitting in your living room, pretending to have authority you don't possess, trying to collect money for violations of rules that don't exist. Lisa stood up and walked over to Pat's evidence table, examining the files and photographs Pat had so carefully assembled. "You know what this really is?" Lisa asked, holding up one of Pat's surveillance photos. "This is evidence of stalking and harassment that I'm going to use to make sure you never bother another neighbor again." Pat slumped in her chair, the reality of her situation finally hitting her. The fake hearing was over, but Lisa's real work was just beginning. The silence in Pat's living room stretched for nearly a full minute as the weight of Lisa's revelation settled over both women. Pat sat frozen in her makeshift judge's chair, staring at Lisa like she was trying to process an impossible equation. "You're lying," Pat finally whispered. "You're just trying to scare me." Lisa reached into her back pocket and pulled out her badge wallet, flipping it open to display her official police chief credentials. "Patricia Williams, my name is Chief Lisa Chen, and you're in a lot of trouble." Pat's face went through several color changes as she stared at the badge. Lisa could practically see the gears turning as Pat tried to reconcile everything she thought she knew with this new reality. But you can't be a police chief," Pat stammered. "You don't act like—" "You're too young. You drive a regular car?" "I drive an unmarked police vehicle," Lisa corrected. "And I've been trying to handle this situation quietly as a neighbor, hoping you'd come to your senses on your own." She gestured at the elaborate hearing setup around them. Clearly that approach didn't work. Pat's hands began to shake as she looked down at all the documents she'd created, the photographs she'd taken, the fake authority she'd built her entire scheme around. For the first time since this whole thing started, she seemed to realize how deep a hole she'd dug for herself. I was trying to help the neighborhood," Pat said weakly. "Someone needed to maintain standards." "Pat, look at me," Lisa said, her voice taking on the firm but professional tone she used when dealing with suspects. "You haven't been helping anyone. You've been harassing your neighbors, trespassing on private property, attempting to defraud people with fake fines, and filing false reports with city offices." She picked up one of Pat's violation notices from the evidence table. "This document claims authority from an organization that doesn't exist. You're demanding money for violations of rules you made up. In the legal system, we call that fraud." Pat's breathing became shallow and rapid. "But I never actually collected any money. No one paid the fines. The attempt to collect money through false pretenses is still fraud, whether you succeed or not." Lisa sat back down, but this time in the chair across from Pat as an equal, not as someone being subjected to a fake hearing. "Pat, I need you to understand something very important. Your behavior over the past month hasn't just been annoying or eccentric. You've committed several crimes." Pat started crying, not the manipulative tears of someone trying to get out of trouble, but the genuine distress of someone who suddenly realized how badly they'd messed up their life. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she sobbed. "It started small, just wanting things to be organized and proper. But then no one would listen, and I thought if I made it more official—" Lisa softened her tone slightly. Dealing with Pat required the same skills she used with mentally ill suspects, firm boundaries but also enough compassion to de-escalate the situation. "Pat, help me understand something." "Why me? Why did you focus so much attention on my house specifically?" Pat wiped her nose with a tissue from her evidence table. "You were different. You kept weird hours, drove different cars, never talked to neighbors about your job. I thought maybe you were dealing drugs or running some kind of illegal business from your house." Lisa almost laughed. "So you decided to investigate me yourself instead of calling the actual police?" "I didn't trust that the police would take it seriously. I thought I needed to gather evidence first." Pat looked up at Lisa with red, swollen eyes. "I never imagined you were the police." This was the moment Lisa had to make a crucial decision. She could arrest Pat right now. She had plenty of evidence of harassment, fraud attempts, and filing false reports. Pat would likely face criminal charges, possible jail time, and definitely a permanent criminal record. Or she could handle this the way she would want someone to handle a neighbor who'd lost their way but wasn't fundamentally evil. "Pat, I'm going to give you a choice," Lisa said, "and I want you to think very carefully before you answer." Pat nodded, looking like she was preparing for the worst. "Option 1. I arrest you tonight. I take you downtown, book you on multiple charges, and let the judicial system sort this out. You'll have a court date, probably need a lawyer, and this will follow you for the rest of your life." Pat's face went white. "Option 2. You immediately cease all HOA-related activities. You apologize personally to every neighbor you've harassed. You never contact me again except for normal neighbor interactions like saying hello. And you get some professional help to understand why you thought any of this was appropriate. Pat stared at Lisa, probably trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. If you choose option 2 and then violate any part of that agreement, option 1 becomes automatic. No second chances, no negotiations. Do you understand? Yes, Pat whispered. Which option do you choose? Option 2. Definitely option 2, Lisa nodded. Good. Now I need you to give me every document you've created related to your fake HOA, every photograph you've taken of neighbors' properties, and every file you've compiled on residents of this neighborhood. Pat began gathering papers with shaking hands, pulling out file folders stuffed with violation notices, surveillance photos, and detailed notes on various neighbors' activities. The amount of material was staggering. She'd been conducting an incredibly thorough stalking campaign disguised as community service. Pat, this is important, Lisa said, as she watched Pat stack documents. Some of this behavior could be considered stalking under state law. The photographs, the surveillance, the detailed tracking of people's schedules, these are serious violations of privacy. I know that now, Pat said miserably. I just got so caught up in trying to fix everything that I couldn't see how wrong I was being. Lisa bagged up all the documents and photos, making sure she had everything Pat had created. One more thing. Tomorrow morning you're going to start making personal apologies to every neighbor you bothered. Not form letters, not notes on doors. Face-to-face apologies where you admit you were wrong and that there never was any legitimate HOA authority. What should I tell them about why I did it? Lisa considered this. Tell them the truth. That you were having trouble adjusting to retirement. You got carried away trying to help the neighborhood, and you realize now that your approach was completely wrong. Pat nodded, looking exhausted. And Pat, the part about getting professional help wasn't optional. You need to talk to someone about why you thought creating fake authority and spying on your neighbors was reasonable behavior. Over the next 2 weeks, Lisa watched as Pat methodically worked her way through the neighborhood, making awkward but apparently genuine apologies to everyone she'd bothered. Mrs. Chen reported that Pat had spent 20 minutes on her doorstep, crying and apologizing for the harassment and surveillance. The Henderson family mentioned that Pat had brought them flowers and a handwritten note explaining that there never had been any community standards violations. Even Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been starting to believe Pat's stories about Lisa being suspicious, got a personal visit and a complete explanation. Lisa kept her distance during this apology tour, but she made sure to stay visible in the neighborhood. She started parking her marked police cruiser in her driveway occasionally, just to remind everyone, including Pat, of the reality of the situation. The change in neighborhood dynamics was remarkable. Once people realized that Pat's entire authority structure had been fictional, they began talking to each other again about how bizarre the whole experience had been. Several neighbors stopped by to apologize to Lisa for ever doubting her, even though she assured them they'd done nothing wrong. Mrs. Chen summed it up perfectly one evening. I can't believe we almost let that woman convince us you were some kind of criminal. You've been the best neighbor any of us could ask for. 3 weeks after the fake hearing, Lisa was in her backyard gardening when she heard a tentative voice from the other side of her fence. Lisa, could I talk to you for a minute? It was Pat, sounding more humble than Lisa had ever heard her. Lisa walked over to the fence. Pat was standing in her own backyard, holding what appeared to be a small potted plant. I wanted to thank you, Pat said quietly, for giving me a second chance instead of arresting me. How are you doing, Pat? Better. I started seeing a counselor like you suggested. Turns out I have some issues with control and authority that go way back. Pat held up the potted plant. This is for you. It's a peace lily. I thought it was appropriate. Lisa accepted the plant through the fence gap. That's thoughtful of you, Pat. The counselor helped me understand that I was feeling powerless about my life after retiring, and I was trying to create situations where I felt like I had control again. Pat paused. I'm really sorry for what I put you through, and the other neighbors too. I appreciate that, Pat, and I'm glad you're getting help. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Lisa, can I ask you something? Sure. Why didn't you just tell me you were a police chief right from the beginning? It would have stopped all of this. Lisa smiled. Because I wanted to see if you'd stop on your own when you realized what you were doing was wrong. And because being a police chief doesn't make me better than any other neighbor. It just means I have different responsibilities. Pat nodded thoughtfully. I think I understand now why you're so good at your job. 6 months later, Birch Lane had returned to being the peaceful neighborhood Lisa had always loved. Pat had settled into retirement more gracefully, channeling her organizational energy into volunteering at the local library rather than harassing her neighbors. Sometimes Lisa would see Pat working in her garden or walking to her car, and they'd wave politely to each other. Just neighbors the way it should have been from the beginning. Lisa kept all of Pat's fake HOA documents in a file in her home office, not as evidence for potential charges, but as a reminder of how important it was to address problems before they escalated out of control. She never had to use that file. Pat kept her word completely, and the neighborhood remained blissfully free of fake authority figures. But sometimes, when Lisa was dealing with particularly difficult people in her professional life, she'd remember the look on Pat's face when she realized she'd been trying to scam the police chief for over a month. It reminded her that sometimes, the most effective law enforcement tool wasn't authority or intimidation. It was simply letting people dig their own holes deep enough to see how far they'd fallen. And sometimes, if you were lucky, that was enough to help them find their way back up.